Friedrich Schleiermacher is one of the most important and significant figures, as well as one of the most controversial figures in the history of Christian theology. He lived at a time of great upheaval, political, intellectual, cultural, and theological, at a time when religion itself, the very existence and practice of religion, was coming under intense scrutiny and enduring severe criticism. In his attempt to set religion on a different footing, Schleiermacher inaugurated a whole new age in theology. Friedrich Daniel Ernst Schleiermacher was born in 1768 in the city of Breslau in Prussia, which is now Wrocław in Poland. His grandfathers were both Reformed pastors, and indeed his own father was a Reformed pastor, also a chaplain in the Prussian army. Friedrich was named after the Prussian king. Now, his father had been educated in very rationalist schools of Enlightenment theology. But around 1778, when Friedrich was 10, his father came into contact as part of his work with the Moravian community and underwent an experience of religious renewal. As a result, a few years later, he and his wife decided to send their children to Moravian schools. At the age of 15 then, Friedrich went to the Moravian school at Niesky. It's a very unusual environment. On the one hand, it was a sort of quasi-monastic community. There was a real sense of separation from the outside world and its currents of thinking. There was a strong sense of discipline, and above all, the school was keen to cultivate the piety of its students, to enhance and nurture their relationship with Jesus Christ. Although conservative theologically, the actual details of the dogmas and the doctrines were not of primary importance. Of primary importance was the life of the students in communion with Jesus, their religious and spiritual lives. On the other hand, it was an academic community that had little by way of examination or assessment. Indeed, students were free within limits to pursue their own agenda. And Schleiermacher took this opportunity of humanistic education to immerse himself in Latin and Greek in particular, skills which would serve him well in the years to come. At the same time, there were, as I mentioned, limits to this intellectual exploration. The school was quite keen to keep the students away from some of the dangerous Enlightenment currents of thinking, this wisdom of the world, which was in much evidence beyond the walls of the seminary. In any event, 2 years later, Friedrich graduated and proceeded with some of the other students to the Moravian Seminary at Barbu. There he entered a similar kind of environment designed to train leaders, theologians for the Moravian community. Again, there was that strong sense of discipline and strong sense of desiring that the students cultivate their religious experience, their piety, their relationship with Jesus. The theology was conservative, very much emphasizing the fallenness of humanity and the consequent need for redemption in Jesus of Nazareth. And that redemption was, of course, accomplished pivotally on the cross, where Jesus died for our sins as a vicarious substitute. Now, Schleiermacher himself was by this time a pietist at heart. He'd had a conversion experience just before attending his first school at Niesky. However, he began to become increasingly uncomfortable with some of these doctrines that were part and parcel of Moravian piety. And that discomfort was started and enhanced by his exposure to some Enlightenment currents of thought. Against the rules of the seminary, he and some of his friends would smuggle in some recent Enlightenment literature and read it clandestinely as a small group away from the eyes of the authorities of the seminary. This opened up a whole new world of thought to Schleiermacher and raised great tension in his life existentially between these traditional Moravian doctrines and these new currents of Enlightenment thinking. Finally, he wrote to his father to confess this existential angst. The move was precipitated when one of his colleagues was expelled and when their reading group was discovered and prohibited. He wrote confessing that he could no longer quite run with the Moravian doctrines and wondered what to do. His father received the letter and was desperately disappointed. He was very vexed by his son's request to leave the seminary. Nevertheless, as a father, he listened to his son and acceded to Friedrich's desire to leave the seminary and to go and attend the University of Halle. Halle was a very famous outpost of Enlightenment thinking in those days. The philosopher Wolff and a series of theologians, including Zemler, had worked there. And their work was still the basis of a heavily Enlightenment thought-dominated curriculum. Friedrich, therefore, moved there at the age of 19, where he embarked upon 2 years of study. He didn't attend many lectures or seminars, but he did embark on private study, particularly of the philosophers that he'd read about clandestinely back in seminary. Of particular note, the works of Plato, the works of Aristotle, and above all, perhaps, the works of Immanuel Kant, recently published, including his critique of pure reason and his brand new critique of practical reason. Friedrich left the University of Halle after just a couple of years. He first spent an unhappy year at his uncle's estate in the country, engaging in private study but really feeling quite isolated. Thereafter, and after passing his first ordination exams, he moved to a country estate to become a private tutor for Count Dohna in the wilds of East Prussia. He was there almost 3 years and loved the experience. Firstly, it was a communal experience, part of the home background that Schleiermacher, to an extent, lost after he went to the Moravian school. Indeed, after the age of 15, he never saw his own mother and father again. His mother died just a few weeks later, and his father was constantly on tour with the Prussian army. And though they corresponded heavily, there was no personal reunion. So to be suddenly in this family setting, a warm, one has to say, affluent, educated family setting, was real bliss for Schleiermacher. He was hired as a tutor then to educate the children of the Count, some of whom he kept in contact with for many years thereafter. He carried on his studies and particularly immersed himself in, for example, the philosophy of Spinoza. This led to tensions with the Count, who wanted a much more traditional upbringing for his children. And so, before things went wrong, they left on good terms. Schleiermacher returned to Berlin, passed his second ordination exams, and then moved into his first assistant pastorship at Landsberg, where he spent 2 years. Perhaps the real big move, however, came in 1796, when Schleiermacher moved for the first time properly to the city of Berlin, capital of Prussia. He moved to take up a post there as chaplain at the Charité Hospital, a large institution with beds for hundreds of patients, and also a nursing home and a retirement home. And he had the usual mix of pastoral care duties there and preaching duties, which he, as a Reformed pastor, shared with his colleague who was a Lutheran pastor. Of more direct importance for his development than this work, however, is perhaps his exposure to Berlin. Here in the capital city of Prussia, Schleiermacher encountered a vibrant and dynamic social scene. He discoursed with its artists, discussed with its philosophers, and loved spending time with its creative people. There are 2 circles of people which he encountered here which are particularly worthy of note. First is the circle of romantic writers and artists. At their heart was Friedrich Schlegel, one of the key figures in the Romantic movement. And on the other hand, there was a very close circle of friends which Schleiermacher developed, including at its heart a Jewish couple, Marcus and Henrietta Hertz, and a young lady by the name of Eleonora von Grunhoff. This lady was one to whom Schleiermacher was instantly attracted. Sadly, however, she was already married to a Lutheran pastor, unhappily so, which made their situation all the more tragic. The off-off love affair went on for many years. It was requited in terms of affections, but never more than that. And eventually, in 1804, it became clear that she would never leave her husband, and Schleiermacher was left forsaken in his emotions at that point. In 1799, surrounded by these artistic, romantic, creative, Enlightenment people, Schleiermacher wrote a text for them by the title On Religion, Speeches to its Cultured Despisers. For precisely in these salons and these circles in which he'd moved, he'd found very little time or taste for religion. Just a few years later, in 1802, Schleiermacher moved to a parish in Stolp, out in the country. And in 1804, he was called to the University of Halle, where he himself had once studied. as an extraordinary professor and as a university chaplain. Extraordinary in the sense that he was reformed amidst a faculty which was otherwise entirely Lutheran. And indeed, Schleiermacher noted at the time that he felt that he was a thorn in the flesh to most of his colleagues. Here he began his teaching career in an academic context, but he wasn't simply a dogmatician. At this point, Schleiermacher also began lecturing on a series of other disciplines, on ethics, on hermeneutics, on biblical studies. And therefore he was something, or had to become something, of a polymath in his work. In 1806, Schleiermacher's early teaching career came to a premature end when the Prussian army was routed by Napoleon and the French army in the battles of Auerstadt and Jena. His house was taken over by French soldiers, his church became a grain store for the French army, and the University of Halle was entirely dissolved. At this point in time, perhaps understandably, Schleiermacher began to develop to a greater extent a sense of patriotism, and he was to serve his country in later years in different capacities. He returned without a job in Halle then to Berlin, where he picked up some teaching on the side, and in 1809 became the minister of the Dreifaltigkeitskirche, the Trinity Church in Berlin. He also married that year to Henriette von Katten, a widow. However, they only had one son, Nathaniel, and he tragically died at the age of 9, leaving both parents